Students, so this video will cover the Dice and Danger assignment, which is your first exploration of using classes and objects in a programming language. So overall, what this program will do is it basically allows us to create a dice class and then create dice objects that will allow us to randomly roll certain sided dice to determine character attributes, strength, constitution, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, and then print out those attributes. So this would be kind of like the beginning of, like a role-playing game where you're assigned a certain character. So basically, before we jump into looking at all these requested files, I'm going to talk really briefly about the difference between classes and objects and why it's really important to programming design. So really quickly, I'm going to run with this kind of silly example of creating a dog class. So basically, the overall difference between classes and objects are that classes are kind of like the blueprint for how you are going to build something, whereas the object is actually the real collection of data that refers to a specific thing in your programming, in your program. So the class will basically lay out the blueprint for what every kind of dog you want to make in your programming game. So every single dog will need to have certain properties, like a color of its coat, eye color, height, length, weight. And every dog will have the following methods, which just mean functions. Every dog will be able to sit, lay down, shake, and come. So what we do is after we build the class in a different, let's say in our test file, we want to start building dogs. So we're going to create specific instances, which just mean unique versions of certain dogs. For example, this dog is built named Rain, and it has the following property values. We could build a second dog called Teddy, and it might have a lot of different property values. Maybe it's a tiny dog. But the important thing here is that this class-object dichotomy allows us to create designs for what all types of objects will have in common. And then we can actually even build subclasses from dog that will inherit dog's information and properties and methods. So we can make specific classes for certain breeds if we want to. But it basically creates this kind of hierarchical design where you can inherit information from a parent class. So really quickly, again, just trying to reiterate the point, objects, they will appear in our programs as essentially collections of data. And all that data is basically specified in the class. What can this object do? It can sit, it can lay down, it can shake, it can come. What kind of properties does this object have? Well, it has a color, eye color, height, length, and weight. So let's take a look at our classes and how we build objects of a certain class in Dice and Danger. Okay, so if you open the dice.cpp file, this is where you'll find the class. So this is the class for dice in the game. So it contains the blueprint for what every single dice that we build needs to have. So one thing that you'll notice is that there are a number of functions in here. There's dice that takes in a number of sides. There's this tilde dice, a roll function, a read function. But before all of these functions or methods, we specify the name of the class first. So you can see capital dice, capital dice, capital dice. These all refer to the dice class. So if this were a dog class, we would write dog in front as the class name. So let's first look at these two methods because they are probably the most unique out of any of the ones in the dice class. So every single class will have a constructor, and these are two constructors for the dice class. And a constructor just means the thing that will be called in order to instantiate the dice object in a different file. So this is the two functions that build the object, so to speak. So this first one is called a default constructor, and it's called a default constructor because when we don't specify what its attributes should be, for example, if we don't specify how many sides we want to build a dice for, it will build just a default object that has 6 sides. This is a 6-sided die. And otherwise, we could build a die object by specifying the number of sides. We could pass in an integer value to a constructor, and then it'll build a die where the number of sides is equal to whatever we specified. So we set sides equal to side. And we have two methods of particular interest in the die class. We have this roll method, which will basically calculate a random number between 0 and sides and store it in a values array. And then in order to get that random number, we need to call the read method, which will return whatever we stored at the beginning of the values array. So let's take a look at that in practice. So if we jump into the diceendanger.cpp file. Okay, this is where we have the two functions for this role-playing game, I guess, written. There's the roll character and the print character functions. So we can see in the roll character function, you should have shouldn't have that stuff. Sorry, that was an example I was going to run with right now. So what you should see is something like this, where you have capital dice D18, and then you have D roll and such stuff beneath here. So here's the important part. This is this first line where we were saying dice and then D parentheses 18. This is a call to the constructor to build a die object called D. And then we're on this specific die object, which will have 18 sides. We're rolling that die and then storing whatever the roll was in the attribute array and doing that 6 times. And that will basically correspond to the 6 character attributes. And then what we're doing is we're printing out the contents of the attribute array to the user to show them what their stats are for all those attributes. So this is an example of using the constructor where you need to pass in the attribute for how many sides the die will have. For example, if I wanted to use the default constructor, so I'll say dice, and the name of my die will be called Michael. And great. So what this will do is this will create another dice object called Michael. And since I'm not passing in any arguments to the constructor, it will call the default constructor and automatically set sides equal to 6. Again, we can see this difference between the default constructor and then the constructor which takes in a sides argument. So now, just to prove that point, what I can do is I'll call some of Michael the die's methods. So I'll say Michael roll, and this will generate the random value, and then if I wanted to output that value, I can say Michael.read, and this will actually return the integer value. And I'm not sure why it's complaining. Maybe I just need to save and run. So so one issue that I'm seeing is that in the, if I'm going to call a default constructor, I won't write parentheses. I'll just say dice Michael, and then I can call all of Michael's methods. So let's run that again. And we should see that it outputs 6. Or sorry, it should output a random number between 1 and 6. So we can see that it is outputting a roll to Michael's dice. If, let's say I make my die have 300 sides, then I should be able to read a value that's between 1 and 300 when I roll that die. So let's do it again. So we just built a separate object, and we're getting a 42 roll. I can do it even again and get even another one, 85. Great. So the big takeaway here is we now know how we can build separate objects, and now we understand that we can call the methods of these different die objects, and they will return different values because they are built differently. That is, Michael, the die, has 300 sides, whereas when we're rolling the 18-sided dice, we're only going to get at max up to between 1 and 18 as opposed to 1 and 300. So I'm going to delete these comments and leave everything the same. So basically, that I just wanted to go over the big ideas in object-oriented programming, which is just to say the kind of program where you are building classes and then instantiating those classes with objects, because it will come up in the remainder of the assignments, and we should become familiar with this sort of syntax where we're specifying a class and then building constructors and then having methods for our objects. So that will be the end of the Dice and Danger video. As we can see, if we already run the program, it meets the assignment requirements, which is just that we can basically roll these characters, and we click Y, we get another character that has different values. So just take this as a lesson in understanding the differences between these files and how they all work together in order to output these different character stats. All right, that's it for me, and stay tuned for the next recording.